Hey everyone, welcome to the Bold and Beautiful 24. I'm Alessio, and I'm so excited to have you here. If you love bold and beautiful, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Alright, let's dive right in.
Steffi felt the weight of the world land on her chest the moment the car door thudded and the woman from the past stepped onto the Forrester driveway as if she belonged there. As if the years of absence, the whispered lies, the funerals, the graves, and the brittle little pieces of peace Steffi had carved for herself could be unstitched with a single, impossible silhouette. Luna Nozawa moved like someone who had rehearsed her return 1,000 times. Small deliberate steps. Hair thrown back from a face that seemed to have been sketched and resketched over and over until nothing human remained but the outline. For a beat Steffi didn't breathe. The world stilled into that cold electric moment where the ordinary breeze through the magnolia, a distant delivery truck, the low hum of LA traffic, dropped away and only Luna's face existed, up close and impossible to ignore. Steffi's hands curled into fists so tight that the knuckles whitened. Her heart hammered not just with fear but with a raw, animal heat that made her vision narrow as if the world were being viewed through the barrel of a gun. "No," she said aloud, the word a flat, small thing that surprised her with how brittle it sounded. Behind Luna, people clustered on the porch, Ridge, Taylor, Hope, each face a mosaic of shock and confusion. How had she come back? How was she here when Steffi had spent the last year building herself from the shards of everything Luna was accused of breaking? Hadn't the world decided Luna had died? Hadn't the hospital report, the missing person notice, the grieving public, all of it sealed the story? Steffi's mind tried to reconcile the impossible. Grief that had calcified into something she'd learned to live with now threatened to shatter under the weight of this triumphant, insolent presence. The word that had lived there in Steffi's chest for months. The one she had buried under therapy appointments and late-night calls to Finn and long, pointless runs, surfaced and became a jagged thing she couldn't swallow. "I will kill you, Luna," she heard herself say. And even then the sentence stunned her because it was not just a threat thrown in anger. It was an eruption of every wound that woman represented, every stolen year with her child, every lie that had been told in her name. The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. But this was Steffi. She was everything a perfect storm could be, fierce, fragile, devoted to the marrow, and at once capable of tenderness and terrible, sharp rage. She'd spent so long protecting her family and hardening around the places that hurt that, when Luna's presence peeled back the scabs, it left her raw. Her body refused to be still. She took a step forward, then another, and suddenly the distance between her and Luna collapsed into inches. She wanted to grab her, to shake from her the truth, to demand that the woman on the porch answer for every single moment of cruelty that had ruptured the Forrester household. The sunlight struck Luna's cheekbones and made her look younger and more insistent than any memory had allowed. Luna's eyes, that soft dark center framed by lashes that always looked like a watercolor stroke, flicked to Steffi and widened the tiniest fraction. There was a second of something like recognition and then, to Steffi's disgust, something else. An inscrutable calm, a tremor of triumph as if Luna had been waiting for this gasp of breath where the world would refocus around her return. Voices bubbled around them. Ridge's low, measured attempt to steer the moment into conversation. Taylor's attempt to be maternal. Hope's stunned silence turning into a siren of accusation edged with fear. But Steffi heard none of it. The clone of all the betrayals she'd felt reduced to one single feed. Luna alive, here, daring to breathe the same air. "You can't be here," Steffi hissed, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "You're not allowed to breathe here." The words were absurd and they did not matter. Steiner's training, the countless debates about defamation and the judicial systems and whatever police report had once marked Luna as dead. None of that shelved the rawness of the moment. Finn stood at Steffi's side, and even his presence, the man who had become her anchor, who had taught her how to make the delicate, brave choices that marriage demanded, could not entirely bridge the chasm. Finn's hand found her arm in a small, grounding pressure. His eyes were thunderstorm gray, and filled with the kind of incredulous tenderness that made Steffi's temper flare and her vulnerability rush hot and immediate through her. "Steph," he whispered, "breathe. Don't say anything you'll regret." If only breathing could reroute what had already slithered out of her mouth. Luna outlined the pain she had endured, or perhaps it was a version of her pain. When someone re-enters your life after being declared dead, you have to wonder if you're being handed the truth or a talisman forged from lies and necessity. She moved with an exhausted fluidity, like a woman who'd spent months learning what surfaces could be trusted. I had to get away, Luna began in that voice that sounded like someone reading their own story for the first time, and deciding which parts to leave out. I thought it was the only way. But her words, tender and fractured, did not melt Steffi. Instead they coagulated into more accusations. The rational parts of the world, the police, the press, the forensics, would demand answers and documents and the truth. Steffi's body demanded retribution. The line between wanting justice and wanting revenge blurred until there was no longer any day or night. Only a hunger for rectification. You left, Steffi said, and the words were simpler but they drove through the back of her throat like a nail. You left Will. You left me to be the one who had to explain his absence. You let them think you were gone. You let Will grow without answers. How could you? Her voice rose, not loud in decibels but in emotional volume. That muffled, terrible thing made the hair on her arm stand up and the muscle in her cheek twitch. She wanted to rattle Luna until she made everything right. The world had been rearranged by Luna's absence and Steffi had spent that time rearranging the world around the empty spaces. Luna inhaled, slow and deliberate. I was scared, she admitted. I didn't feel safe. There were people who wanted to hurt me. I couldn't let them find me, not then. If Luna sounded like someone offering an apology, it was a measured apology. If Luna sounded like someone justifying betrayal, it was also that. Then you should have died, Steffi said, and the sentence landed like an ugly coin between them. It wasn't just the bitterness of abandonment. It was the sense of being robbed of a right. The right to mourn, to memorialize, to have a truth to point to when nights were hardest. While other women had chosen to make peace with absence, to fold it gently into the life they continued to live, Steffi had been forced into mourning that had a hollow center because there was no body to bury. Grief had its rituals and deprived of them, she had made do with vengeful, private rituals of her own. You were supposed to be punished, she said, not really wanting it to be said aloud. You were supposed to be out of Will's life. She imagined a calendar where every day Luna had been gone was a theft. Every missed milestone for Will, every scraped knee, every first day at school, every little triumph he'd celebrated without his mother. They were all the kind of petty cruelty that sets people's blood to boiling. Finn swallowed and his jaw did a small, decisive movement that betrayed his attempt to stay neutral. He, more than anyone else, understood how grief could warp into obsession. He squeezed Steffi's arm, a plea both tiny and enormous. The porch felt suddenly smaller. People's faces were close enough to read like headlines. Rich with the look of a man trying to steady a ship in storm. Morality and stability wrestling with the reality of a woman who had been presumed dead. Taylor's hands fluttering like the wings of a bird that wants to care but fears the beak. Hope's face an unreadable map of shock that veered between sympathy and suspicion. And then Will appeared. Will with his reckless, tender heart and the messy, idealistic way he had always loved wildly. He stood at the threshold, caught between the world he had grown into and the woman who had once been his mother, and now was some mythic return. Steffi had always been the fierce, gritted-teeth protector. She'd promised herself that she would make sure Will never needed to fear that which had taken him from her. Seeing Will look at Luna was like seeing a thin, fragile thread stretched across a canyon. Will was younger than the years he'd been alive. His face had the earnestness of someone still learning how the world balanced cruelty and mercy. His mouth parted and then closed, and when he took a step forward, the movement was careful, as if he were approaching a wild animal. "Mom," he said, voice a question and a plea. He had so many rights to his confusion, to all of it, and Steffi's chest constricted with the knowledge that whatever she did now would echo through the rest of Will's life. She wanted to shout at him to run, to gather every scrap of his childhood and bolt out of the house until he could understand the labyrinth of adult choices. She wanted, oddly and fiercely, to protect Luna from whatever the Forrester wrath would mete out. And that tug was a small betrayal within her own bones. Loving Will twisted her logic. Being his defender meant sometimes being his enemy. "Don't," she said, too sharply, then softer as if trying to tamp the flame she'd ignited. "Not now." We need answers. Luna's gaze landed on Will and softened. She moved as if to step closer and then faltered, the line of her body showing the battle between want and restraint. I know I have a lot to explain, she said, and there was a tiny tremor at the edge of her voice like a thread fraying. There were reporters somewhere beyond the hedges. The town is always hungry for its own blood. And Steffi could feel the circled gaze of imagined cameras. She thought of the headlines that would come. Mother returns. Scandal at Forrester. The thought made her throat close. She had endured the limelight's cruelties, the petty, venomous tongues that thrived on others' grief. And if Luna's return set the tabloids ablaze, every open wound in their household would be picked and pried. Why now? Taylor asked, her voice fragile with the same maternal need to heal and to know. Luna's hands twisted in her jacket pockets. There was a tremor of humility suddenly apparent that had been absent in her initial swagger. Because I couldn't pretend anymore. Her voice was small, and for the first time there was an honesty that cut through Steffi's anger like a keen blade. I wanted to be there for Will. I wanted to tell him I loved him. The confession was simple, perhaps real. Steffi recognized the shape of it and hated herself for the way her heart ached at that admission. For the way every mother in the world must have loved before they judged. But the past is not an innocent thing to unpack. There were accusations, the old rumors that had never quite died. That Luna had been involved in schemes, that her disappearance had been part of a dangerous plan. That she'd betrayed people she had never truly understood. Steffi's mind flashed. Those nights when the house felt empty and she had lain awake listening for memories that might be fake. The nights when she'd told herself to be grateful for the life she had and the family she'd built around the empty chair at the table. Everyone had to decide whether Luna's return was salvation, or a summons of trouble. Why didn't you tell anyone you were alive? Steffi demanded, venom masked in civility. Did you want us to suffer? The sentence came out sharper than she intended and Luna flinched as if struck. There was an ache there that made Steffi's anger wobble. For a flicker she saw not the intruder, but a woman who had been preyed upon by a world that often asks victims to vanish quietly rather than rage. Finn had the steadiness of a man who had been in too many storm fronts to be stunned into silence. He moved forward and didn't block Steffi but offered what protection he could by being present. We need to get you somewhere private, he said to Luna, voice low and practical. We can figure this out. She nodded, grateful and weary, and Ridge stepped in to offer the Forrester guest room with the awkward hospitality of someone who wants to be noble despite the mayhem swelling in their hallway. As they moved inside, Steffi lingered on the porch and watched the tiny caravan of two women moving toward the threshold of the house that had once been Luna's anchor, and then a mausoleum of memory. She wanted to run after them, to demand more, to tear the truth into threads and make Luna hand over the map of her life, but she stayed where she was and let the door close between them with a sound like a verdict. Alone for a moment, outside the concentric circles of concern, Steffi let herself feel the vertigo of possibility. That Luna meant to stay, that she wanted to be a mother again, that she might be dangerous not because she was violent, but because she might unravel everything they'd attempted to build. Inside the house, voices were quieter, laden with the gravity of what it meant for a child to meet a mother after years of absence. The way joy warps into grief when it collides with the truth. Will's hands were small in his pockets. He looked at Luna as if trying to remember the shape of a dream. Steffi imagined telling him to be cautious, to hold his heart lightly as if it were a glass ornament that could shatter if handled too roughly. She told herself to be better than the instinct that had made her shout those words. The threat that now sat like a stain she couldn't wash out. Everything in the Forrester house had been designed to feel safe. Whether that safety was real or an elaborate fiction, it had created a set of rules for their lives. Luna's presence was a breach. It invited chaos and demanded reckoning. The truth would have to be told, but for now, the air hung with the kinds of secrets that did not like to be rushed. Steffi's hand reached for Finn's on the armchair, and found it with a grip that said she needed an ally to hold the line between reason and the hunger to punish. Outside, the evening sky bruised into violet. Steffi's anger cooled to something more complex. Sorrow braided tightly with a fierce, brittle protectiveness. She had a fragile son whose life had been splintered and remade. She had a husband who sat across from her with worry etched into his forehead. She had parents who would want to archive every detail of the returning woman's explanation. And there was Luna, who had come back like a comet, leaving behind a wake that would take weeks, months, years to navigate. Steffi's threat, that monstrous, "I will kill you, Luna," drifted like a bad dream in her mind, something she could not fully claim as herself yet also could not forget. It had been an honest, ugly confession of how deep her anger ran. She resolved, with a calm that contrasted the earlier eruption, to channel that anger into something less permanent than blood and more useful than spectacle. She would find out the truth, she would make sure Will was safe, and she would make choices that, if not noble, would be smart. But underneath that rational decision-making lay the thin thread of watchfulness. Steffi would be the sentinel at the gate of Will's heart, and she would not let that heart be wounded again without exacting a reckoning for it. The storm had arrived at their doorstep in a petite, impossibly human form, and the Forrester household would be tested as never before. There would be meetings with lawyers, conversations with police, 1,000 private phone calls and accusations whispered into the darkness. There would also be quiet nights where Will might reach for a different hand in the night and find it empty. Steffi forced herself to breathe, to think, to prepare for the long fight she knew this would become. Love, after all, is a battlefield, and she had learned how to be brutal in the defense of those she loved. Luna could stay, she told herself, but only if she proved she was not a current that would sweep Will away into danger. If she failed, if the woman who had returned with a soft, tremulous voice was less a mother than a menace, then Steffi would be there ready. Ready to fight, ready to expose, ready to protect Will at any cost. As the night wrapped itself around Los Angeles and the Forrester lights flickered on like beacons, Steffi found herself at once smaller and more absolute. She watched Luna and Will sitting together on the living room couch, speaking in small, awkward sentences, and felt every human contradiction writ large in her chest. Pity and contempt, hope and fear, a longing for reconciliation tangled with the desire for justice. She had shouted the most monstrous sentence she could imagine, and now she had to live with the consequences of its echo. She had been the storm incarnate earlier, face flushed and voice cracked, but now she drew a firmer, colder line and promised herself she would not be reduced to violence. She would be strategic. If Luna was an angel who had been lost, and then returned to reclaim what was hers, the house would bear witness. If Luna was a siren of chaos, Steffi would unmask her. The night crackled with possibility, and between the hush and the electricity of returning lives, Steffi realized that the real fight had only just begun. There were reporters somewhere beyond the hedges. The town is always hungry for its own blood. And Steffi could feel the circled gaze of imagined cameras. She thought of the headlines that would come. Mother returns. Scandal at Forrester. The thought made her throat close. She had endured the limelight's cruelties, the petty, venomous tongues that thrived on others.